The wedding hall looked like something out of a movie. Crystal chandeliers. Soft music. Guests in designer suits. Everyone smiling, laughing, celebrating a rich man's perfect day. A young waitress moved quietly between the tables, holding a tray of champagne glasses. She kept her head down. She knew her place. Then it happened. One glass tipped. Just a few drops spilled. The rich man's smile vanished. He stood up so fast his chair crashed to the floor. In front of hundreds of guests, he shouted at her. Called her names. And then, he slammed his hand hard against the table, sending glasses flying. The music stopped. The hall went silent. The waitress froze, her hands shaking, eyes filling with tears. No one helped her. Not the manager. Not the guests. Not even the bride. That's when the heavy doors at the back of the wedding hall slowly opened. Boots echoed across the marble floor. Leather vests. Grim faces. A biker gang walked in. And at the front of them, a man who didn't raise his voice. Didn't rush. But whose presence alone made the rich man's face turn pale. Because this wedding was about to become something no one would ever forget. Before the story continues, if you believe no one deserves to be humiliated, like this video, subscribe for real stories, and comment below where you're watching from, your city or country. I want to see how far this story reaches. The groom, a man whose wealth and influence were legendary in their town, held the room's attention without even trying. He walked with confidence, head held high, a slight smirk playing on his lips as guests whispered compliments and stories about his business empire. Every gesture, every movement screamed authority. He had the kind of presence that demanded obedience without a word, the kind of aura that made people nervous to speak their minds. He had worked hard for his money, everyone agreed. But along with it came arrogance, entitlement, and a belief that the world revolved around him. He enjoyed attention, craved admiration, and expected perfection from everyone around him, especially from those who served him. Mistakes, in his eyes, were personal insults. Tonight, he had already indulged in several glasses of champagne, which only amplified his ego. The staff moved quickly, trying to keep pace with his whims, but he found their caution amusing. He pointed, gestured, and made comments that drew nervous laughter from his friends. The young waitress passed by with another tray, careful not to draw attention. She had seen him laugh at minor mistakes before, but tonight felt different. His eyes scanned the hall, sharp and judgmental. When she accidentally brushed against a chair too closely, he noticed immediately. A smile twisted into a scowl. He raised his voice in mock anger, calling attention to her minor slip. Guests shifted uncomfortably, some laughing nervously, others avoiding his gaze. He loved the reaction, the control, the fear, the silence that fell over those who knew they dared not contradict him. For him, money and power meant dominance. Respect wasn't earned, it was demanded. And tonight, as he prepared to humiliate the young waitress publicly, the entire wedding hall would witness just how far his ego could reach. The young waitress moved cautiously between the rows of elegantly dressed guests, balancing a tray stacked with sparkling champagne glasses. Every step was deliberate, measured, careful not to disturb the perfection surrounding her. She had passed hundreds of weddings before, but none carried this much pressure, this much scrutiny. Then, a single glass wobbled slightly, tipping just enough to spill a few drops on the pristine white tablecloth. It was barely noticeable, but it was enough. The groom's eyes narrowed instantly. His smile vanished, replaced by a sharp, predatory glare. He stood so quickly that the polished chair scraped against the floor. The room froze, as if the music and laughter had been sucked out of the air. "Are you serious?" he barked, his voice cutting through the hall. Guests turned their heads, unsure whether to intervene. Some tried to laugh it off nervously, but the tension was undeniable. The waitress's hands trembled as she steadied the tray, barely holding back tears. She whispered an apology, her voice almost lost beneath the sudden silence. The groom, intoxicated and arrogant, ignored it. He leaned over, slammed his hand hard onto the table, rattling the glasses and causing a few to clink dangerously. The sound echoed through the hall like a gunshot. Gasps filled the room. Eyes widened. Even the bride's expression faltered. No one dared move. The manager remained frozen, unsure whether to step in or retreat. In that instant, the entire hall understood the imbalance of power. Money had turned this man into a judge, jury, and executioner, and the young waitress had become the center of his merciless spotlight, humiliated in front of hundreds. The wedding hall was suddenly frozen in a moment of uneasy silence. The spilled champagne, the slammed table, the groom's booming voice, all had created a bubble of tension that seemed to hold every guest hostage. Conversation stopped mid-sentence, laughter vanished, and the soft classical music that had been playing evaporated into an eerie quiet. The young waitress stood motionless, her hands trembling, the tray clutched tightly as if it could shield her from the judgmental eyes surrounding her. Guests stared, unsure whether to intervene or simply watch. The groom's chest heaved, his ego satisfied by the fear he had instilled. And then, just as the tension reached its peak, the massive doors at the back of the hall began to creak open. Heavy footsteps echoed against the polished marble floor. Every pair of eyes turned instantly toward the source. The doors swung wider, revealing a group of men clad in leather jackets and boots. Their presence was undeniable, quiet but commanding, intimidating without a single word. The room seemed to shrink, the air heavier. The groom's confident smirk faltered for the first time that night. Whispers rippled through the guests as they realized that someone entirely unexpected had arrived. At the front of the group stood a man whose calm, piercing gaze swept across the hall. He did not raise his voice. He did not rush. Yet in that moment, his presence alone changed everything. The balance of power had begun to shift. The man at the front of the group moved with a confidence that seemed to command the entire room without a single word. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in a black leather jacket adorned with intricate patches that hinted at stories of loyalty, respect, and battles won. Every step he took echoed on the marble floor, a rhythmic warning that this was no ordinary arrival. His eyes scanned the hall slowly, deliberately, taking in every detail. Guests shifted nervously under his gaze, the laughter and chatter of the wedding replaced by an uncomfortable, palpable tension. The groom's smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. He had encountered arrogance before, but this was different. This man exuded authority without needing to assert it verbally. The leader's face was calm, almost serene, but there was an unmistakable intensity behind his gaze. A faint scar traced his jawline, a mark of past conflicts that commanded respect. He carried no weapon, made no threats, yet the silence he imposed spoke louder than any yell. As he stepped closer, the young waitress instinctively straightened, hope flickering in her eyes. She had seen the fear he inspired in others, but also the protection he offered. He looked directly at her, a subtle nod acknowledging her courage and the injustice she had endured. The rest of the biker gang fanned out behind him, standing tall and silent. Their presence reinforced the leader's authority. They were loyal, disciplined, and ready to act if necessary, but for now, their mere presence was enough. The entire hall seemed to hold its breath. Even the groom, who had believed money and arrogance could control any room, felt a weight pressed down on him. He realized, for the first time that night, that the rules had changed. This was no longer a wedding about wealth and status. This was a confrontation about respect, and the biker gang leader had arrived to make that very clear. The young waitress stood frozen, her hands gripping the tray as though it could shield her from the weight of the room. The spilled champagne and slammed table had already shaken her, but the arrival of the biker gang, calm, commanding, and unyielding, added a new layer of intensity she could barely comprehend. Her knees weakened. She blinked rapidly, trying to hold back tears that threatened to spill. The hundreds of eyes in the hall bore down on her, guests, the groom, even the bride, each one silently judging, waiting for her next move. She whispered a soft apology, almost lost beneath the tense silence. Her voice shook. She felt exposed, powerless, yet oddly aware that someone in the room might finally see her struggle. The biker gang leader's piercing gaze met hers, and she felt a strange mix of fear and relief. He did not rush to her. He did not speak yet. But in his calm observation, she recognized acknowledgement, a subtle signal that she was not alone in facing the humiliation. A trembling sigh escaped her lips. She realized she had carried this fear silently for years, enduring disrespect quietly. But tonight, in this hall of wealth and arrogance, she could no longer hide the weight of it. Her hands quivered as a single tear rolled down her cheek. The tray wobbled slightly, threatening to topple, but she caught it just in time. The biker leader's eyes softened momentarily, reassuring her that dignity was not lost, even in front of a crowd of hundreds. In that instant, the waitress broke, not into despair, but into recognition that someone powerful and just had arrived. Her courage, long suppressed, quietly flickered to life. The biker gang leader took a deliberate step forward, his boots echoing against the polished floor. The hall seemed to shrink around him, the air thick with anticipation. Guests leaned forward in their seats, unsure if they should move or stay frozen in place. The groom's confident stance faltered slightly, but he forced a smirk, convinced he could still command the room. The leader's voice, when it came, was calm, measured, and carried an authority no one could ignore. "Is this how you treat people?" he asked, his eyes fixed on the groom. Not a shout, not an accusation, just a quiet, piercing question that reverberated through the hall. The groom laughed nervously, trying to mask the unease. I was just disciplining her," he stammered, gesturing toward the trembling waitress. "She made a mistake." The leader's gaze didn't waver. A mistake does not deserve humiliation in front of hundreds. Respect is earned by how you treat those who serve, not by how you wield your money. The hall fell silent again. Guests exchanged glances, whispers spreading like wildfire. The bride looked uneasy. The manager shifted nervously, realizing that someone had finally spoken truth to power. The young waitress exhaled slowly, the tiniest trace of relief washing over her. For the first time that night, she felt someone in the room recognized her dignity. The biker leader didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His words, deliberate and sharp, cut through the ego and arrogance that had ruled the room moments before. In that instant, the rules had changed. The balance of power had shifted, and everyone, even the richest man in the room, could feel it. The groom, who had believed that wealth and arrogance could control every room he entered, now felt a chilling weight pressing down on him. The biker gang leader stood firm, unyielding, his presence alone commanding authority. Behind him, the gang fanned out silently, a wall of silent strength that made it impossible to ignore the shift in energy. Guests began to notice the change. Conversations had stopped. Laughter had vanished. Even the wedding photographer hesitated, unsure whether to continue taking pictures. The once dominant groom felt eyes on him, not of admiration, but of scrutiny. For the first time, he realized that power in this hall could be measured by respect, not money. The leader's voice cut through the silence again. Control isn't about fear or force. It's about respect. And tonight, this woman deserves the same dignity you expect for yourself. His words were calm, deliberate, but every syllable carried the weight of authority. The young waitress' hands, still trembling, slowly relaxed. She stood a little taller, emboldened by the silent support radiating from the bikers behind the leader. The room, once dominated by arrogance and entitlement, now held a new order. The groom's smirk disappeared entirely. He opened his mouth, perhaps to argue, but no words came. The presence of the bikers was undeniable, their silent solidarity a force he could not challenge. Guests whispered, glancing between the leader and the humbled man. The shift was complete. Money, status, and ego had lost their power in that room. What mattered now was respect, courage, and justice. The balance had tilted, and everyone, even the richest man at the wedding, knew it. By the end of that moment, the power in the room belonged to the biker gang leader, and to the dignity he had restored for the young waitress. The room remained tense as the biker gang leader's presence continued to command attention. Guests whispered among themselves, finally recognizing the stark contrast between arrogance and integrity. The groom, once untouchable, now felt exposed, stripped of the confidence that had carried him through countless social events. The manager, emboldened by the shift, stepped forward cautiously. "Sir," he said, his voice firmer than it had been earlier, "this behavior is unacceptable. You will need to leave until things are resolved." For the first time that night, authority came from more than money, it came from principle. Guests began to murmur louder, some nodding in agreement, others shaking their heads in disbelief. The bride's expression had softened, realizing that the spectacle of wealth and perfection had crumbled under the weight of respect and justice. Phones were discreetly lowered, attention was fully on the unfolding reality. The groom attempted to defend himself, stammering excuses about a misunderstanding, but no one listened. The silence around him emphasized how isolated he had become. Even his closest friends avoided his gaze, their laughter replaced by uneasy glances. The waitress, trembling but resolute, felt a strange sense of relief wash over her. The humiliation she had endured moments before was now countered by undeniable public recognition of her dignity. The room understood, money could not buy respect, and cruelty had consequences. In that wedding hall, a clear message had been sent: power and wealth were meaningless without humanity. Justice had been quietly served, not through violence, but through integrity and courage, leaving an impression that no guest would ever forget. The tension that had gripped the wedding hall slowly began to dissipate. Guests exhaled softly, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others murmuring quietly about what had just unfolded. The music, once halted by the chaos, resumed gently, filling the room with a soft, comforting melody that contrasted sharply with the intensity of moments before. The young waitress stood tall, her hands finally steady, a subtle glow of relief on her face. She glanced at the biker gang leader, who gave her a small, reassuring nod. It was enough, a quiet acknowledgement that she had endured, that her dignity had been recognized. The bikers, calm and composed, remained near the back of the hall. Their presence was steady, protective, and non-threatening, a silent reminder that justice did not always need loud words or violence. The groom, humbled and subdued, retreated to a corner, his arrogance replaced by a wary awareness of his own limitations. Guests began to relax, yet a newfound respect lingered in the air, as if the entire room had collectively learned a lesson about power, empathy, and integrity. For the first time that evening, the wedding felt human again. It was no longer just a display of wealth and status. The focus had shifted toward respect, courage, and the quiet strength of someone who refused to be broken. The biker gang leader stepped forward once more, his presence commanding attention without a single raised voice. He looked directly at the young waitress, then at the humbled groom, and finally at the assembled guests. "Respect," he said slowly, "is not bought with money. It is earned through your actions, your words, and the way you treat every person around you." His eyes swept across the hall, emphasizing every word. "Tonight, you saw the consequences of arrogance and cruelty," he continued. "No wealth, no title, no influence can excuse the way someone treats another human being. Dignity is priceless, and it must be protected." The room fell silent again, everyone absorbing the weight of his words. Even the bride's eyes glistened, realizing that the lesson of the evening reached far beyond the luxury and spectacle. He turned back to the waitress, giving her a slight nod. "You stood tall. You did nothing wrong. Remember that courage and respect are always stronger than fear and humiliation." With that, he stepped back toward his gang, leaving the hall in a quiet, commanding calm. His message had been delivered. And in that wedding hall, the lesson would linger far longer than the music, the champagne, or the glittering lights ever could. The biker gang leader and his crew slowly exited the hall, their boots echoing softly against the marble floor. Silence lingered in their wake, a quiet reminder of the authority and respect they had restored. The young waitress exhaled deeply, a small smile tugging at her lips. She had survived the humiliation, and now her dignity stood tall in front of hundreds of witnesses. Guests whispered among themselves, still processing the dramatic turn of events. The groom, humbled and subdued, avoided eye contact, aware that his arrogance had been exposed for all to see. Even the bride scene changed, reflecting on the lesson of respect and humanity that had unfolded before her eyes. Slowly, life returned to the wedding. Music resumed, laughter cautiously followed, and glasses were raised once more. Yet the hall felt different, quieter, more thoughtful, filled with a newfound understanding that wealth could never replace decency. The waitress glanced at the door one last time, where the bikers had disappeared, and realized that courage and integrity could change a room, or even a life, forever. The wedding would be remembered not for luxury, but for justice, respect, and the power of standing up for what is right.